Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, music lovers and audiophiles. Today we're going to review the Theoretica Applied Physics Bach for Mac Stereo Purifier, a product that intends to dramatically improve stereo accuracy in a unique way. I hope you enjoy this. Alright, here's a quick summary. Some of you have asked for a faster unfolding of the point of these videos. Well, I don't think you can genuinely comprehend what I'm about to say without the context that I supply later. A summary is rather easy. The Bach for Mac processor corrects certain distortions inherent in normal stereo reproduction so that you can hear the musicians located in space the way the recording engineers placed them. Or, an even simpler version is that with Bach, you can hear musicians in up to a 270-degree arc around your listening position, which is potentially much larger than the normal 60-degree arc of stereo sound. There are other benefits to the spatial presentation of the musicians as well, which I found very beneficial. So the net is, Bach processing provides a dramatic, easily audible, and more accurate rendition of stereo presentations, with very few downsides. This is likely one of the few major technological shifts in audio in the last 25 years. If you have a system valued at over $10,000, and maybe less, your next purchase probably should be the basic Bach processor. At least that's the safest bet for a high improvement per dollar ratio. I hope you'll stick with me because this is significant and interesting, to me at least. But if you don't like details and long explanations, that's fine. Now's the time to switch to a more entertaining, if less life-changing video. Okay, with that introduction in mind, let's first take a look at what Bach processing actually is. Bach for Mac, the product we're reviewing here, is a version of the Bach processing system created over the past 10 years by Theoretica Applied Physics. Theoretica is the brainchild of Dr. Edgar Schwery, who is the director of Princeton's Electric Propulsion and Plasma Dynamics Laboratory, which focuses on advanced spacecraft propulsion systems. That might be cool, but as it turns out, he also heads the 3D and Applied Acoustics Lab at Princeton, which is the home of the research program that led to Bach. Schwery is an avid audiophile and a student of recording, two related fields that come together in Bach. Bach processing previously has been done in a special box, with software of course, and it's quite expensive. Andy Quint reviewed this system here a year or so ago. Recently, Theoretica released a version that runs on Apple Mac computers and gets the price point down from around $20,000 to under $2,000. There are various versions of Bach for Mac, starting at $980 plus the cost of a Mac, assuming you don't have an M2 Mac lying around unused. So let's call it about $1,600 for the most basic version. The fancier versions go up to about $8,700 plus the Mac for what's called the Pro setup, but you probably don't need the recording capabilities or the headphone processing of the Maximum Supreme Bach for Mac. So figure $6,700 for the advanced audiophile version. The audiophile version offers head movement tracking because you inevitably move your head a little bit while you're listening to music, and it also does custom compensation for the exact shape of your head. It'll become apparent in a minute why that's important. We reviewed the Bach for Mac Pro version, but that does exactly what the audiophile version does when you use it in a stereo system. The software is somewhat complex to set up, but Theoretica does a call with you and runs your Mac remotely, so they're both showing you how to do setup and actually doing the setup. This initial call takes perhaps an hour, and then you're good to go. After that, you really don't have to touch the software unless you change your stereo setup, in which case you can do another call if you want to. Or you might remember how to do it. Anyway, What are the problems we're trying to solve here? Because that probably isn't completely apparent yet. We have said in the past, and it bears repeating, that there are at least 3 great unsolved issues with stereo music reproduction in the home. First, the problem of bass in real rooms. Second, the problem of visual imagery. Third, the problem of spatial presentation. Bach for Mac is built to address the latter of these. Let's talk about the problem of spatial presentation. This is what Bach for Mac is built to address. Some people, your humble reporter included, observe that the sound space and instrument placement and rendering of instruments in a conventional stereo is not fully realistic. You might say that a common problem is that performers seem to be playing from within the speakers at times. I also like the rendition of this that Linkwitz had. He said it's kind of like small performers are playing on a stage that is small, arrayed between the speakers. He's talking about small relative to what you would hear in, say, a concert hall or a club or some other concert venue. Audiophiles, myself included, work hard to make the stage as wide and as deep as they possibly can, and then get the performers placed on it as correctly as is possible within this kind of miniature stage situation. Audio companies and recording engineers also work really hard to enable this, but we're all generally working within a framework that accepts these constrained stage limitations. Bach for Mac asks, why is this limited sound space happening in the first place, and can we address it? Of course, you know the answer. They think they can. All right, let me suggest you fasten your seatbelts, because in this next part we have to undo some assumptions, and if you don't get the assumptions that most of us have undone, you really can't understand what's going to follow this. At least my experience is that we have to do this kind of unseating. The first assumption that many audiophiles, many reviewers have, is that stereo is designed to allow placement of performers anywhere between the speakers. That, often, is what we think stereo actually means. So if a performer is on the left side of the stage, he or she would be presented from the left speaker. If the performer is in the middle of the stage, he or she would be presented in the middle. If the performer is center right, he or she would be presented in between the middle and the right speaker. But if you go back to the original Blumlein patent for stereo, which dates from 1931, this wasn't the idea. Or said differently, this between the speakers idea is wrong. Instead, stereo is intended to be able to present the performers where they were during the performance, unrestricted by speaker location. Yes, present the performers where they were during the performance and not be restricted by speaker location. To further understand what the original idea of stereo was, you may have to give up another idea. Many people think that the speakers are delivering a version of the sounds that were recorded and presenting them into the room in a simulation of what happened in the concert hall or the club. You then hear something that is roughly like what you would have heard live, but is a function of how well the speakers in the room simulate that. The speakers set up a stage and performers, and the reflections in the room create a sense of the space. The problem is that is not what happens, or at least what should happen. What should happen is that the recording consists of 2 data streams, one for the left channel and one for the right channel. These data streams have all the information about performer placement encoded in them. That is, if a performer were to the left of the mics, so if this is the mic to the left of the mic from my perspective, for the left channel, the data about that leftward placement is on the recording. This data is sent to your ears from the speakers, and here's the kicker. Your ear and brain have the ability to decode that data and place the performer where he or she was when the recording was made. So if the performer was outside of where the left microphone is, the performer will be outside of your left speaker. Yep. Let me just say that again. Your speakers are data conduits, not performer simulators. Let that sink in for a minute because you need to understand that to get the rest of what Bach for Mac does. Now, I still haven't really explained where the problem lies. So here we go. My apologies if your head hurts after this, but might also feel good. All right, let's start with a live performance. To keep this as simple as possible, I'm going to concentrate on what happens to your left ear and to the left microphone. But it is very important to say the right ear and the right mic are logically just like this. I'm also going to simplify by assuming just two performers and just two mics. The logic would be the same with more performers and hall reflections and more mics, but the algebra gets really messy. You may think the algebra is messy as it is. Okay, take a look at this diagram. What your left ear hears in a live performance is shown here. Your left ear hears the direct sound from the left performer. Your left ear also hears the sound from the right performer, but modified by the distance and time delay and frequency shaping caused by the right sound having to kind of wrap around your head. In technical terms, this is called the head-related transfer function, but I've simplified this by calling what the left ear hears from the right performer R mod H for right modified by head. I'll come back to this, but ideally your stereo would present your left ear with a signal that is L plus R mod H. You will soon see that it doesn't. Now consider what happens when we make a recording of these two performers. Instead of your head, or in the place where your head was in the prior diagram, I've shown two mics in a Blumlein arrangement. The left mic, which will feed the left channel, records the direct sound from the left performer. It also records the sound from the right performer, modified by the distance and time delay and off-axis pickup pattern of the left mic. So in my representation, the left channel of the recording is L plus R mod M, or left plus right modified by the mic. Now this isn't exactly what your left ear heard, but I hope you can see it's similar in form. Then consider what you hear on your stereo. Again, we're just going to consider what your left ear hears to keep it simple. From the left speaker, your left ear hears L plus R mod M. So far, so good. That's pretty similar to the data stream your left ear heard in the concert hall, which is L plus R mod H. But. Your left ear also hears sound from the right speaker, which is R plus L mod M. Now hang with me on thinking of these as data streams, not virtual performers. When you think of it that way, you might realize that with standard stereo, we have a huge error term being introduced to your left ear. Everything from the right speaker that your left ear hears shouldn't be there. You're hearing R plus L mod M in the left ear, and you should not hear any of that term in the left ear in order for the left ear to hear something like what it would have heard in the concert venue. Now, to understand Bach, I want you to consider that the standard stereo presents a massive distortion signal to each ear. That distortion signal is what we're calling here R plus L mod M. At least that's the one the left ear hears. Assuming that the right speaker signal at the left ear is roughly the same magnitude as the left speaker signal, standard stereo has something like 50% distortion. That kind of fits, if you ask me, in the whoa category. Now, it's important to note that this is not a musical distortion. It's not interfering with the sense of music because you're playing a very similar signal from the same band. It's not harmonic distortion, and so the number probably overplays how audibly distracting this error term is. But, and this is the point I want you to remember, the error term is big, and it is not harmonically distorting, it is spatially distorting. Now, getting back to Bach processing, the Bach software removes the error term. They call it crosstalk cancellation, but it isn't the internal to equipment kind of crosstalk that we're accustomed to that they're talking about. It's kind of an acoustic crosstalk cancellation. That's all Bach does. So, maybe the significance of what Bach does is more understandable if I say that Bach processing removes a 50% distortion. Now, removing that amount of error or distortion in practice without damaging the music along the way is no simple task. So when I discuss the sound quality of Bach, I'll address how well it does this and how much extraneous damage there is. Stay tuned for that. Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. As you may know, I'm Tom Martin, Chief Content Officer of The Absolute Sound. We have a new product. It's on the Substack platform, and we're going to do some interesting things with Substack. First of which is reader questions and answers. Each Monday, readers will submit questions. We'll pick the most interesting ones and we'll answer the questions on Friday. We'll also have early access to articles and special blogs that don't appear anywhere else. We hope you'll join us. It's only a cost of a cup of coffee per month. Just check on the screen or in the show notes below. Thanks, and now back to the show. All right, how does Bach processing sound? A simple summary is that Bach makes a dramatic difference to the sound you hear. That difference varies from recording to recording, however. The recording to recording observation brings up important point number one. Bach processing is not adding something to the signal in an attempt to simulate kind of what you would have heard in the concert hall or club or recording studio. Bach is subtracting a signal that shouldn't be there to properly render the performers in space. I think that point of view helps you understand why Bach might be able to succeed and why Bach seems to be a significant step in the direction of realism. Let me give you some examples of how Bach processing sounds. Using the Mozart string quartets, K515 and 516 with the Eben quartet in high res, what I first noticed is that the quartet is spread out in a very clear semicircle. And the semicircle extends very slightly beyond the width of the speakers. Then I noticed that each instrument seemed to stand out in space, so it sounds like the players are actually occupying not just the semicircular positions that I described before, but that each player seems to have an instrument that's got a whole spatial property to itself. I think that's as it would sound in real life if the violin or the viola or the cello were actually in your room resonating. In addition to the semicircular array of the instruments, the players on my reference system, particularly the second violin and viola, seem to be behind the front wall. Those are the normal instruments that would be placed in the back of a quartet arrangement. The stage depth with Bach is deeper than just working in the space behind the speakers. You know how sometimes you feel like and it may be due to visual cues, you feel like the stage is kind of confined by the dimensions of your room. Bach seems to violate that principle in a, I think, pleasing way by placing the performers in your brain, at least, wherever they were actually recorded. The next thing I listened to was the Freewheeling Bob Dylan from 1963, also in high res. This is a really simple recording. It's Bob, his guitar, and his harmonica. With Bach, you hear Bob in the center, where you would kind of expect him, if you think about how most stage performances are arranged. But then the recording engineers put his guitar on the right and harmonica on the left. That's not how it would sound live, but this is a studio recording, and you hear how the engineers place things so that it sounds a bit like a trio. Apart from the deviation between studio and live, what's impressive is that the guitar occupies a space that extends outside of the right speaker, and the air surrounding the guitar feels appropriately sized for the Dreadnought Gibson that Bob played in this period. This album does raise a persistent Bach conundrum, which is, do you actually want to hear the musicians where the recording engineers place them? You'll have this issue in normal stereo, of course, so it's just not so clearly presented. Next up, I had the Esbjørn Svendsen Trio on the jazz album From Gagarin's Point of View. The mix on this seems to me just about perfect, with the performers arrayed on a stage in front of you with a real sense of depth. The tonality of the instruments is beautifully rendered, but the part that Bach does, or adds, if you will, is the sense that the players are playing in a large three-dimensional space. The reverb off the rear wall and the side walls and the front wall just seems so much more natural and like they were actually playing in a club that it's borderline transformative. The reason it feels transformative, to me at least, is that this added realism subconsciously helps you suspend disbelief. Realism, it turns out, isn't really an analytical, nerdy thing. It's a critical part of engaging with the music, or at least I felt it was for me. Then I tried the Mahler Symphony No. 1. This time I used the Minnesota Orchestra recording. It's high res, made in 2019. I had a similar feeling that Bach processing enhanced the sense of the orchestra being in a large, three-dimensional space. The instruments are farther toward the back of the hall, and those were presented properly, with horns and timpani appearing back there. The reverberant field is so well captured that the sense of the musical reflections floating above the orchestra is somewhat stronger than what I'm accustomed to with regular stereo, but it's very much like what you hear when you're actually in the concert hall. Now, for something completely different, let's talk about Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. This is a recording where I'm pretty confident, from things the band and the engineers have said, that the band wanted a surround sound kind of effect, rather than a simulation of what you might have heard if you heard Pink Floyd live, playing 200, I hope they were 200 feet away from you or you'd be deaf right now. The first track with the heartbeat, you may be familiar with that because you've probably heard this album a bunch of times. Anyway, that track's called Speak to Me. Toward the end of the track, there are some voices and helicopter effects and chimes. You probably remember all this. And they're placed way outside of the normal stage area with Bach. In fact, some of these sounds are located behind the listener. I mean that you hear the sounds as if they were coming from a speaker set behind you to the left or the right. They're that clear. But there's no speaker there. As I said, the data is locating the sound there, and it's not muddled when you listen via Bach, so you hear it where the recording team presumably wanted it. The helicopter and voices also move around laterally in a clear way, as if they were moving around your room. The next track up on Dark Side of the Moon is called Breathe. And for this one, my feeling was the listener was placed in the center of the band. David Gilmour's guitar is to the left and slightly behind the listener. Richard Wright's organ is to the right rear of the listener. Roger Waters and Nick Mason are presented in the traditional stereo stage in front of you. The instruments move around a little bit, and that again seems to have been intentional. It's very much a surround sound, listener in the center of the band, psychedelic kind of thing, but strangely, it kind of works. Then, listening to Radiohead on their In Rainbows album, I was again struck by the ability of Bach processing to take each instrument and give it its own place in the mix without blurring it together with other instruments. So, I can honestly say I haven't heard this album sound as good on my reference system as it does with Bach. Now, we also need to consider what appears to be an album where the engineering places some of the instruments outside of the normal stereo stage. I'm going to assume here that's what Radiohead wanted, but it is possible that the engineers didn't know exactly what they were doing, at least as it would be heard through a processing system like this. So you might find that slightly unnerving, although for this kind of music, it somehow seemed appropriate again. And I have to say it was very engaging. The approach is a little bit like that semi-psychedelic stuff that I heard on Dark Side of the Moon, but the recorded effects were more subtly presented here than on Dark Side of the Moon. I also want to say that more of what the engineers did on In Rainbow seemed to create that sense of the performers operating within a large space, and I think that's why I was so impressed with how this sound was rendered. I do need to, because I've been leading there, describe an addressable downside of Bach processing. Let's take Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers album, Booze Delight. The players are arranged in a 270-degree arc around the listening position. That might be effectively where the microphones were. However, I have to say it's a little bit odd to hear Blakey playing in a position slightly behind where I'm sitting and on the right side. Then there's a horn off to my left side and behind me. Other players are also arrayed as you would typically hear on stereo between the speakers. But the total effect is just not what you would hear in a club because you wouldn't be in the middle of the band. This studio recording is from 1961, which is only a few years after stereo became a common thing, and I just don't think stereo recording in the studio was evolved to the point where the engineers were trying to do this. I think the engineers wanted Blakey far right, so they pan-potted him hard right, and the data on the recording places him in the right rear, which they didn't know is what was going to happen with this kind of processing. I got similar results to this with Dave Brubeck's Time Out from 1959, so I think it just may be where stereo recording was at that point in time. As a contrast, to show you how recording technology seems to have evolved, or recording techniques seem to have evolved, I played Bill Frisell's album Valentine. It's a jazz trio recording, but from 2020, so we're now 60 years on, and it sounds phenomenal. The spatial presentation is excellent, the sense of air is excellent, and the realism is very high. Going back to Blakey and Brubeck, you can set up Bach processing with choices of different levels of crosstalk cancellation to address the issue I heard there. With 25% rather than 100% cancellation, the Art Blakey recording sounded more normal and I think correct. The fact that recordings can present performers in a 270-degree arc with Bach doesn't mean that all recordings will be spread out in that arc. It means that 270 degrees is kind of the maximum that you can have if the recording wants to place sounds there. If you're on full crosstalk cancellation and the engineer has placed somebody far left behind you, essentially minus 135 degrees from dead center, or minus or plus 135 degrees from dead center on the right, you'll hear them there. But if the engineer placed the musicians in the middle, between the speakers, as with the Bob Dylan recording, the performer is going to be in between the two speakers in the center, just like you're used to from time immemorial. So, with Bach processing, the stage width will vary from recording to recording, and sometimes dramatically so. All this talk about arcs and performer placement may do an injustice to what I think is one of the big benefits, maybe the big benefit of Bach. To help you imagine this other element, I would say Bach seems to give each instrument not just its place on the stage, but its own sense of 3D air and size. I referred to that early on, and I want to come back to it because I think it's a big thing. It's almost as if each instrument gets its own speaker, and that speaker amp combination, whatever you want to call it, can devote all of its energy to perfectly representing the sound of that one instrument. This idea that each instrument has its own channel gives you a sense of the purity and the clarity of harmonics and instrumental size and detail that Bach delivers. This could be summarized as a sense of higher resolution, but you have to think of it in kind of a 3D presentation of each instrument sense. I want to keep emphasizing that this clarity or resolution is not a spectral byproduct. It's a spatial byproduct. You could better hear into what's going on in the instrument. And, as I said before, I think this delivers more suspension of disbelief or a significantly greater sense of realism. I also need to comment in a broader way on spectral balance. Apparently one of the hard things, there are more than 50 pieces of intellectual property in Bach. Anyway, one of the hard things about crosstalk cancellation is doing it without disturbing the frequency response of the music. I won't say that the balance of my reference system was exactly the same with and without Bach, but it was very close to the same, so much so that I can't really describe what the difference is. I never felt the need to describe the impact of Bach processing, even if I could, in frequency response terms. That's the way changing components often show up in my head, but that's just not how Bach sounds to me. It sounds like the same frequency balance as I'm accustomed to hearing without it. All right, let me take a shot at a summary, because this has been a long and relatively complex review. But I hope it's obvious that I think Bach processing is a significant advance in stereo reproduction. On maybe 80% of the albums you might play, especially those from the last 40 years, Bach for Mac delivers an image that is freed up from the confines of your speakers. This gets some parts of the image off the speakers and expands the stage width, stage depth, and stage height in an important way. That important way is to make the performer seem more spatially real and help with the suspension of disbelief that often accompanies recorded music. Performers and instruments take on a more three-dimensional quality, and their freedom for spatial placement by the recording engineers gives a three-dimensional feel to the stage. Additionally, Bach helps to present the ambient cues from the recording venue so that you subconsciously feel that you're in a real space. An analogy may be useful to understanding all this stuff. Conventional stereo is a bit like watching performers on a television. As we improve many of the core technologies of stereo, the TV, if you will, gets bigger, and the TV resolution gets higher, and the colors are more accurate. That's all good, but you never really escape the sense that the performers are locked inside a window defined by the edges of the TV, and you often sense that the image is actually flat, even though high res helps generate a better sense of depth. Now, turning to stereo, but continuing the analogy, with Bach, it is like watching movies on a hologram generator or a VR headset without needing a headset. There isn't a hard edge to the stage, depth is more realistic, and you feel somewhat like you're in the room with the actors who themselves are three-dimensional. Now, I also need to say that recordings have been made and could continue to be made that are more in this surround sound vein that I spent some time on. Bach for Mac does an impressive job with these, but I think those kinds of recordings are musically unusual. I need to emphasize that. And it's important to understand that this extreme capability for placing performers is not really what Bach processing is primarily about. I want to add that I suspect that if Bach for Mac couldn't do accurate surround sound, it couldn't reveal the virtual concert hall environment that I found so delightful. And who knows, maybe if Bach were more commonly used, some musicians would make surround sound elements musically effective. This view also should be contextualized by saying that I would consider Bach for Mac to be a Type 3 product. These are major game changers addressing fundamental issues of audio. These probably only come along every few decades. That Bach for Mac is fundamentally a new thing and yet works with minimal side effects is unusual and I think really impressive. Bach for Mac comes to market at a price that's quite reasonable in high-end terms. It has few downsides, if any. After all, you can turn it down or off for any recording. It addresses a real issue for audio as we know it, and does this for all existing stereo recordings. That means it doesn't require new equipment or a change in recording technology, as we've frequently seen when the state of the art has been advanced or attempted to be advanced in the past. I do think Bach could encourage a refinement of recording technique if engineers used it as part of the mix and master process, because they would really know what data they're putting in those bits. I hope that happens, but even right now, Bach for Mac is a legitimate breakthrough. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please click on the subscribe button. Also click the notifications bell. That way we can keep you aware of new videos that we're doing, which are coming along every week. We'd also love it if you would sign up for our weekly newsletters. You can find information on how to do that in the show notes. And as always, we would really appreciate it and enjoy it if you would subscribe to the Absolute Sound magazine. We've been publishing it for 50 years now, and it has some of our flagship material. Hope we see you again soon.